Welcome to the first ever episode of Turnaround Talks, a monthly podcast from TMA Florida. Each month, we'll bring you quick insights, real experience, and trends that matter in the turnaround space. I'm your host this month, Ken Yager, and I'm excited to kick things off with our featured guest, David Weinstein. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here. I love the inaugural version.
Yes, it's a perfect time to get a conversation going about where we are in our industry and talk about your history and kind of link those two things together. So with that, David, I want to ask you a couple of questions for our audience, and we'll just have a conversation about your career and a little bit about what you're seeing today, and also the pearls of wisdom from an industry veteran such as yourself. So with that, let's get started. David, our first question: had a long career at Turner in turnaround, credit, and restructuring. From your early days at CIT, Arthur Andersen, and now Phoenix Management and JS Health, what drew you into this field originally, and what kept you here?
That's a great question. Other than the fact that you stressed a long career, it all started on a dark and stormy night back in March of 1988 when I was at CIT Business Credit working on restructurings. And Joe Policino Sr., who was the chairman of CIT at the time, came up to our floor and said, whatever Darla Moore is doing across the street at Chemical Bank with these DIP financings, figure it out and let's do it. And that put me into the DIP financing world, blind and naked at the time, to figure out how to do DIP deals. And back in the late 80s, we had a lot of busted LBOs. We had Allied and Federated. We had Texaco. We had Braniff. We had Eastern Airlines. We had all the major players that went bankrupt because they were over leveraged. And at the time, it was kind of the new wave of bankruptcies, and DIP financing was an incredibly safe and secure way to do lending. That led me to do a lot of DIP deals over the next, 4 or 5 years as the markets kept going. And Arthur Andersen was a great referral source for me because they were representing a lot of these big debtors that filed for bankruptcy. And at that point, Jim Laughlin, who was a partner in charge of FAS, Financial Advisory Services at Arthur Andersen, asked me to come and sit on his side of the table. So that was my first flip from the lender credit side to do the advisory side. And the premise was, if you put these deals together, you can sit with us as the advisor, the FA for the account, for the operating entity of the account, and help us unscramble the egg that you probably put on the table. So that's how I got to Arthur Andersen. And that led me down the path of every 5, 6, 7 years, flipping the table, going from the advisory side to the credit side. Friends of mine used to comment that I put the deals together, that I was the only one that could unscramble it. So I became a consultant again. And that's how I kept going back and forth. It allowed me really to be on both sides of the table, to see both sides of this coin, with very large companies having direct influence over the outcomes. And that's what kind of kept me engaged, is the ability to move the needle on what we were doing, fixing something that was broken at the time.
Gotcha. And what part of all that was most intriguing to you? What kind of drew you in?
Well, obviously the process was interesting. I remember telling my mother-in-law, a school teacher at the time, saying, oh, I got this great job opportunity. I'm going to run around the country providing big loans to bankrupt companies. And her reaction was, is that a good thing? I said, well, you've got the priority liens and you've got the shutdown of the interest payments and you got all these, da, da, da. And she said, but you're lending more money to a company that just went bankrupt. So that was the intrigue, that why are we doing this as a credit person? Why does this make sense as a business? And it was a way to rehabilitate a company. There were certain benefits back in the 80s with the high leverage companies, that with the bankruptcy filing, you could shut off the interest payments and all that LBO debt, the leverage buyout debt that inevitably was on these balance sheets. That gave you instant cash flow because you took out hundreds of millions of dollars of required interest payments they didn't have to make. And all of a sudden, you had a lot of free cash flow to run the business while you figured out what to do with the operations. So it was always the intrigue of, how do you fix something that's clearly broken, and who's going to come out standing at the end of it?
Interesting. I think that really helps out our audience. So taking that, now let's talk about how this expansive work that you did kind of informed you. And so the way I like to think of it is, you've worked on both sides of credit. You're at Ares, Congress Financial, Next Edge, to name just a couple, and advisory firms like Morris Anderson, Lakeside, Phoenix, to name just a couple. How does having both perspectives shape the way you approach a turnaround engagement?
I would tell people I remember the secret banker handshake. So there's a language that bankers use as they talk about their needs and their concerns in a restructuring and a bankruptcy and a liquidation. And having been the creditor that was sitting across from my borrower telling me what they wanted out of this versus what me as the banker wanted out of it versus me as the advisor telling the client what the bank wants out of it, I was able to really kind of bridge the barrier between the banks getting crazy and thinking they can command the situation to what the debtor was or wasn't willing to do, and kind of being that intermediary between the two because I had a clear understanding of what each side wanted. Having the debtor tell me what their family concerns are, their estate concerns, this is a family business, this is whatever it is, and trying to convince the bankers that, yeah, you could go in and take the collateral, but what are you accomplishing? You're not going to get repayment. You're going to, so there's a happy middle ground. I have a client right now that we're fighting with our bank. They think they can take the collateral, sell it, and get out when the economics aren't going to help them. So I think it's the ability to, having been both an advisor to the borrower and to having been the lender to the borrower, I'm kind of that middleman. I'm Switzerland. I'm neutral between the two.
It seems like you can see all four corners of the room at the same time. And that's
Sometimes the room closes in too.
yeah, right, exactly. Well, it's also you probably understand when that's happening. You know where your
Right.
leverage is better than
Yeah,
you.
no, exactly. Like I say, the secret banker handshake and the secret language of bankers. When they say you're in special assets, you're in workout. Yeah, let's understand what we're talking about. You're not special, you're a problem.
Exactly. All right. Well, that helps out explain it a little bit, but I want to take it a little bit further. You've emphasized in past roles the idea that sound financial management is an everyday event. Can you share an example where applying that mindset helped shift the outcome for a client?
We used to use in my role at Cohen Resnick, our moniker was bad to good, good to better, better to great. And you can have a great company and you can be thinking you're running very efficiently, but there's always something that can be tweaked, either at the shop floor, at the financial level, at the operations level, at the market level, that could be better, go from better to great. If you have a bad company, either on the upswing, it's a startup. TMA tends to focus on the downswing as you're falling into, distress. I think that there's a need for sound financial management as a new company. There are different challenges, lack of capital, lack of market presence, lack of systems, and process. And I think the things that we apply towards a distress situation could easily be applied to a growth situation. And I think, the area there is if you think you're doing well, you can probably always do better. You may be buying your product well, and maybe you could be selling it better. Maybe you're selling it well, but you're not buying it better. Maybe your shop floor is disorganized. I used to always love shop tours because you could go to the guy on the workbench and say, what would be better for you? And it could be something as simple as, well, they got this screwdriver here. If it was on my other side, I could grab with this and do. And it's the simplicity of how to improve the shop floor operation. Financial management is one thing. You can play just so many games with debt and leverage and working capital and, moving the noodles around. But when you get down to running the company, what is the right level of inventory? What's the balance of inventory? Where's the obsolescence of the inventory? Why don't you get rid of the inventory that you're not selling anymore? So there's always that nature of, like I said, bad to good, good to better, better to great. And there's a spectrum.
Yeah. So peeling that back just a little bit further, you talk about sound financial management, and it sounds, as a fellow TMA member, this sounds very sound advice, but it doesn't seem like it's very commonly practiced. What goes wrong with people? Why do you suppose they don't have sound financial rigorings? What is it they missed?
I think the quick answer is a lot of it is ego. A lot of it is not admitting what they don't know. Certainly with family businesses, my experience has always been it's hugely judgmental. The grandfather started the business, knows everything about the company, how to fix the toilet in the men's room as to how to sell the product. The son of the grandfather, the founder, worked there all his life. He was there during college. He came out of it and he was just as solid as the grandfather. The third generation has always historically been the kiss of death because the grandfather and the father say, I don't want my child, son or daughter, to have to work like I did. Let's put them in marketing. Let's let them go to all the conferences. Let them play golf and go to lunch so they have it easier. That leads to a mindset when the grandfather is out of the business, when the father is aging out and has an estate plan to deal with. Now you've got somebody that's been in the company for years, but has never been deep into the operations other than the sales and marketing, which a lot of people think is the glamour part, is the wining and dining, the entertaining, and the travel. I have a moniker where whenever I go up to a distressed company, TMM, and that stands for Too Many Mercedes. When you walk up to the front door and the 3 reserved spots for the grandfather, father, and the third generation person, and they all have big Mercedes. The son, the grandchild has the sports car, the father has the sedan, and the grandfather has the older Mercedes. TMM is one benchmark where people don't realize that they could be more efficient and more effective if they just took a step back and said, if I wasn't running this company and I wasn't living off this company, what would I want to be doing different? The third eye, the objectivity of somebody coming in independently and assessing what's going on.
Fantastic. Thanks for elaborating on that for me. All right, let me take you to a different direction now. Not only have you been amazingly deep in the restructurings and finance worlds and turnaround consulting, but you've also had a career path that has followed the Turnaround Management Association through multiple local organizations as well as the global organization. And for me, as someone who's worked with you in that capacity, I'm amazed at the things that you know. But let me ask you this question about your second job as running a TMA chapter. You've been deeply involved in both national and chapter leadership within the TMA. What role has TMA played in your career development and network? What would you tell someone else about that, this position that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question because you always think about, well, what did I invest and what did I get out of it? And where's the return on the investment of both time and money and expense and whatnot? And, for me, I got involved, as I said, in restructuring in 1988 when we did all those big dips. And TMA was just a brand new organization. I couldn't begin to tell you how many chapters, but it was small. And I was in New York City at the time. And, I was asked to step up and be the president of the New York chapter to try to grow it, having been exposed to all the major bankruptcy lawyers and the other lenders that are doing restructurings or refinancings. And it gave me a network of people that, like me, have long careers and have aged out. But these are people that over the 40 odd years I've been doing this, I consider friends. I socialize with them outside of just, looking for business. We're at points in our career where we're kind of, all looking around, what's our next play? And I think it's about the relationships. I tell young people, I try and mentor young people that you can't go to a TMA event to check it out and then say, I'm not going again, I didn't get a deal. Well, it doesn't work that way. I mean, how many times have I heard, well, I went, I didn't get anything. Did you meet people? Yes. Did you follow up with those people? Yes. Did you meet people at your level that as you age up, they will age up with you? People that I know now that are senior managing directors were assistant vice presidents when we started. And I can count those relationships that I can call them and say, we've known each other for 40 years. And that's invaluable. The payback is not instantaneous. It is relationships locally, it's relationships nationally, it's influencing the direction of the association and the industry that we're in by being on the national board. I was president of New York. I was president of Connecticut. I'm a past president of Florida. So I tell people if I do one more chapter, I get a set of steak knives. But it's led me to, a relationship with people, you in particular. You and I have known each other for a very long time, long before I moved to Florida, and we've become much closer professionally and socially. So I think it's about maintaining relationships. It's at my level, it's maintaining them. At a younger level, it's about building them. I tend to go to some events and say, I don't need to see new people. I would just want to connect with my old people and make sure that I'm in touch with them because, do the young people want to talk to me? I want to talk to the young people. The answer is I want to mentor, but they're not going to provide me with business, but I can provide them with inside education. So it's a push-pull, it's a give and take, it's a, mentor-mentee. And I think it's an invaluable investment of time and money because you've got to pay for these things, but it pays itself back. 2/3, 3/4 of my entire professional success, I can trace directly to TMA relationships.
That's fantastic. And that's really showing an investment and really the value of the long game.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's a long game.
yeah, let's take that long game and let's go to the here and now here, and we'll wrap up with this question. If you could leave our listeners with one takeaway about the state of turnaround management today, what would it be?
Well, it's a good question because we've got, macroeconomic issues that affect us. We've got microeconomic issues. We have, a stratified caps table that we look at the cap stack. You've got, major money center banks, you've got major regional banks, you've got private equity firms that are doing distress, you've got privately financed fincos, you've got bank-owned fincos, you've got hedge funds. I mean, you've got a whole litany of people that have different agendas for how they want to get into a deal and how they want to get out of a deal. That with people in the industry, the younger people have not been through an economic cycle that's been bad. If you look at the last, call it 15 years, forget the real estate bubble, we've had low interest rates, relatively low interest rates. Leverage has gone up, but the cost of capital has gone down with the interest rates. Now we're seeing that high leverage having high interest rates and companies can't service the debt. So, it's about learning from people that have done this before. There are tricks and trades and, there are processes that can be passed down from generation to generation. But I think it's an openness and a willingness to not think because you've done this before. You haven't. These are different economic times than they were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and 5 years ago, where there was no distress. You had the government funding everything. You had zero interest rates. It's a different ballgame now. So I think it's a function of, where do I see it? Adapt, modify. Those that were doing distress move to doing LBOs. Those who were doing LBOs move back to distress. So be fluid and thinking about where we are and what to do about it. Be open to the possibility that you might not know everything.
Oh, that's fantastic. David, this was great. I appreciate all of your wisdom and your time today. With that, I'm going to tell our guests listening to this podcast that this has been a wonderful conversation with David Weinstein, a true pillar of the TMA and one that we should all be listening to.
Thank you very much, Ken. I enjoyed doing it and hope it's useful.
It is. Thank you so much for your time. And with that, our TMA Florida audience, thanks so much for listening in on our podcast. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.